Sunday, January 4th, 1976. A fairly normal day by most standards in Northern Ireland. Jimmy Reavey got the family out of bed for Mass at 10 a.m. After Mass, they gathered outside for a friendly chat before heading home. Usually in the Reavey house there would be many visitors on a Sunday afternoon, but on this day it was a bit different. Jimmy's wife, Sarah, or Sadie, was visiting her sister and went with her husband and two others. Initially their son, John Martin, offered to drive them, but he realised that his favourite TV show, Celebrity Squares, was on, so Oliver brought them instead. That left Brian, Anthony and John Martin alone in the house, eating biscuits and watching TV. At around 6:10 in the early evening, the men saw barrels of automatic machine guns appear in the window above the front door of the house. Thinking it was just British soldiers carrying out a house check, the men did not react. At that moment, the door burst open and 3 armed men came inside, unleashing a barrage of machine gun fire at the young men inside. This episode tells the story of brothers who were shot and killed in their home. We'll explore the investigation into their murders, the secret ties between loyalist militants and some police and soldiers, and the campaign of harassment their family faced for decades afterwards. So let's get into it. This is the Troubles Podcast, a podcast about the violence and bloodshed that occurred in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland and Great Britain, as multiple sides and organisations waged a bloody conflict over the status of Northern Ireland. By 1974, the conflict in Northern Ireland, known as the Troubles, was well underway. 1972 saw the single largest death toll in the entire conflict and saw 476 people killed. 1973 saw 253 people killed, and 1974 saw 294. These killings had to stop, and there was a mounting pressure on all sides for some sort of resolution to take place. A provisional IRA ceasefire began during Christmas in 1974, which turned into an official truce of sorts in February 1975. The ceasefire was called to allow for the IRA to continue secret talks with the British government. They believed that this was the beginning of a British withdrawal from Northern Ireland, so it is in their best interest to keep the peace and prevent their members from carrying out attacks. But as we will learn, the attacks still continued. A number of incident centres were set up around Northern Ireland to monitor the ceasefire and also ensure that there was a reduction in security force activity in nationalist areas. But even with the ceasefire in place, 1975 was an incredibly chaotic and violent year when it came to the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Shortly after the February ceasefire was called, a feud broke out between the official IRA and the INLA, which saw a number of assassinations taking place. A feud also broke out between the UVF and UDA, which saw a number of assassinations. All the while, civilians and soldiers in Northern Ireland continued to lose their lives as well. The UVF also began targeting the Republic of Ireland, planning to derail a train with a bomb in Straffan in County Kildare. This was stopped after passerby Christopher Phelan spotted them and tried to interrupt their operations. He was stabbed to death, but it's believed that his interruption caused enough of a delay to prevent the bomb going off as the train was passing. Then, on July 31st, we had the Miami Showband massacre, which has been covered in detail in this podcast early on. This saw a group of loyalists set up a fake military checkpoint as the famous Miami Showband were driving from Northern Ireland to the Republic. The men were taken out of their vehicle, and then 2 UVF members attempted to plant a bomb inside their vehicle. The bomb prematurely detonated, killing the UVF members. 3 of the band members were then shot and killed by the fake soldiers. It's believed that the loyalists wanted to covertly plant a bomb, which would then detonate when the band crossed over into the Republic. It would then look like the band had been ferrying bombs across the border. Just 2 weeks after the Miami Showband attack was the Bayardo Bar attack, which saw provisional IRA members stage a gun and bomb attack on the Bayardo Bar in the Shankill, which killed 5 people. There were bombings in London as well, and it was these months in the middle of 1975 that the Balcombe Street gang were at their most lethal. As the year wound down, the killing intensified, and it was often civilians who bore the brunt of the violence. On September 1st, 5 Protestant civilians were killed at an Orange Hall in Armagh. This attack was claimed by the South Armagh Republican Action Force, which was probably a cover name for IRA members who wanted to sidestep the ceasefire. Another attack saw Dublin Airport bombed by the UDA, which killed 1 person. Then, on December 19th, the Red Hand Commandos exploded a no-warning car bomb in Dundalk, killing 2 people. On December 31st, the INLA killed 3 people in a bomb attack on a pub in Guildford, Armagh. And with that attack, 1975 had drawn to a close. The ceasefire was still holding, but it wouldn't for much longer. This brings us to the Reavey household. The primary source for this episode is the book The Killing of the Reavey Brothers, which was written by Eugene Reavey and Ken Murray and released in October 2025 by Mercier Press. I'll leave a link to the book in the show notes. The book is written from Eugene's perspective, and he recalls growing up in an area which had become known as the Murder Triangle, which was a region in Northern Ireland that included the towns of Lurgan, Portadown and Craigavon, and was known for its high number of incidents and fatalities during the Troubles. The Reavey family were a Catholic family who lived in Whitecross, South Armagh. They were a large family, with parents Jimmy and Sarah, or Sadie, having 10 children. The family was very close-knit, attending Mass together on Sundays and often having large gatherings. By 1976, Eugene was 28 and working as a poultry advisor. He was married to Roisin and they had 2 children together. Jimmy and Sadie lived in the family home in Whitecross with some of their children, both younger and older. In the days leading up to the attack on the Reavey home, there was some unusual activity nearby. A mile down the road from their home, an unidentified man approached 2 Catholic families who lived there and told them to vacate their homes at night. By this stage, there had been a lot of killings in this area, so 2 of the families who were warned heeded the warning and worked on their farm in the day, then left before 7 p.m. and slept in relatives' houses for a few nights. Nothing came of this, but a few days later, on Friday the 2nd of January, Brian Reavey and a neighbour were in the family home chatting. They were smoking cigarettes and left the front door open to let the smoke escape. Out of the blue, 3 armed men in military outfits walked in and ordered the 2 men outside. Brian and the neighbour lay face down on the ground while the armed men chatted amongst themselves before leaving. One of them had an English accent. Before the men left, they said to Brian that they were returning to England next week and that they would shoot him before they left. Brian didn't take this threat very seriously, as this was a common threat that a number of people in the area had received. The following day, a bomb was placed at the doorstep at a pub that John Martin was drinking in, but nobody was injured in this attack. This brings us to Sunday, January 4th, 1976. In the Reavey family home, everyone was up and had gone to the 10 a.m. Mass in Carricanany. Then it was custom for all of the Reaveys to meet up at the parents' house and have dinner, but this day was a bit different. Sadie told them not to come as she was going to visit her sister. So instead of 20 plus people in the house that evening, there would only be the ones still living at home. Initially, John Martin offered to drive them, but then he realised his favourite TV show, Celebrity Squares, was on. So Oliver brought them instead. They all watched the news at 6 p.m, then departed a few minutes later. That left 24-year-old John Martin, 22-year-old Brian, and 17-year-old Anthony alone in the house, eating biscuits and watching Celebrity Squares on TV.
One of these celebrities is sitting in the secret square, and the contestant who picks it first could win all the fun of the fur. Which celebrity is it? Is it Magnus Pike? Patsy Rowlands? Terry Wogan? Pat Coombs? Arthur Mullard? John Conte? Roy Hudd? John Inman? Or Willie Rushton, all joining Bob in the big box game Celebrity Squares. And here he is, the star master of celebs, the big square himself, Bob Monkhouse.
At around 6:10, the men saw the barrels of automatic machine guns appear above the front door of the house. They didn't react, as they presumed it was British soldiers carrying out a house check. At that moment, the door burst open and 4 armed men came inside, unleashing a barrage of machine gun fire at the young men. They were wearing army jackets and began shooting as they burst through the door. John Martin was hit with a volley of shots, falling out of his chair and collapsing on the ground. As he lay there screaming, another volley of shots was fired at him. Brian and Anthony had made a run for it. Brian was shot in the back, with the bullet piercing his heart. He collapsed into a bedroom fireplace. Anthony made his way into a bedroom and hid underneath a mattress. A gunman followed him and fired 30 shots into the mattress. 17 shots hit Anthony. Thinking he was dead, the gunman returned to the kitchen. They believed that there were more people still in the home, so they fired more shots through all the doors before fleeing. Underneath the bed, Anthony was still alive, though gravely injured. He waited until he heard a car speeding off from the house and then crawled out on his hands and knees to his brothers. Brian was sitting lifeless in the fireplace where he collapsed. Anthony checked his pulse. He was dead. He then made his way over to John Martin, who was lying in a pool of blood in the living room. He was also dead. His clothes had been ripped to shreds from the velocity of the gunfire. Anthony needed to raise the alarm, but he was growing weaker and weaker. He crawled on his hands and knees 200 metres to the neighbour's house. Along the way, a neighbour in a car passed him. He tried to flag the car down, but the neighbour thought that he was just fooling around and continued driving. Eventually he reached his neighbours, the O'Hanlons, and banged on their front door. Angela and her son Patrick opened the door. He collapsed into their arms saying, "I've been shot, and they've all been shot." The family made him comfortable, then called the RUC, a local doctor, and their priest, Father Hughes. A few minutes later, Oliver returned from dropping his parents to his aunt's house, to a scene of absolute carnage. He left his brothers happily chatting and watching TV, and walked in the door to John Martin lying dead on the floor in a pool of blood. He ran up the street to the O'Hanlons, where he found Anthony, who told him that Brian was also dead. Soon Father Hughes and Dr. Joe Stewart arrived at the Reavey family home. Father Hughes administered the last rites on John Martin and Brian, and then Dr. Stewart confirmed that the men were both dead. They made their way to the O'Hanlons' house, where Anthony was also administered the last rites, as they were unsure if he would survive or not. He was brought to Daisy Hill Hospital in Uri. Father Hughes then went to see Jimmy and Sadie and break the news to them. They were both stunned, and he gave them an injection of diazepam to prevent severe shock. In her shocked state, Sadie said, "Why didn't they shoot me instead?" Another priest, Father Malone, then appeared at the door of Eugene's home. He told him that there had been an accident at the cottage and to get his coat and head there straight away. He said that there were presumed fatalities, but he wasn't certain. Eugene reached the cottage around 7 p.m. A police rover and ambulance were outside, as well as some officers and concerned neighbours, but nothing was sealed off. He tried to walk in the main entrance of the home, but was told by an RUC constable that he couldn't enter. He pushed past him and walked into the living room, where John Martin lay in a pool of blood on the ground. In one of the other rooms, he saw an RUC officer searching cabinets in the kitchen. He shouted to him, "What are you doing?" The officer said he believed that there was ammunition stored there. Eugene replied, "You won't find any unless you're going to plant it." Eugene and his 14-year-old cousin grabbed the officer by the neck and forced him out of the home. Eugene returned into the house and his cousin remained outside, where he was given a beating by the officers. He walked around the home and stumbled across the body of Brian, who looked as if he had simply sat down and fallen asleep. Jesus Christ, Eugene thought. What did we do to deserve this? The paramedics then came and began to survey the scene, so Eugene went outside, just as his 15-year-old brother Paul arrived on his bike. Paul had spent the evening out with friends and had no idea what occurred. Then another brother, Frank, arrived, and the Reavey parents at around 8 p.m. Detectives soon arrived on the scene and took one of the brothers, Oliver, away to interview him. The family remained outside the home for most of the evening in a state of shock. Eugene heard one of the police radios say that a car had been found burned out. Over in London, another sister, Kathleen, was working as a nurse. She was getting her children ready for bed when her husband called her into the living room. On the TV was a report saying that 3 men from a large Catholic family in South Armagh had been shot. She immediately knew it was her brothers. Alice Campbell was working as a trainee nurse in Daisy Hill Hospital. She was engaged to Brian Reavey, and he had dropped her off at the nurse's living quarters at 5:30 before heading on to his parents' house. She had no idea what had transpired and was getting ready to start her shift when there was a knock at the door. She was told not to go on duty that night, as her fiancé had been involved in an accident back in the house. She eventually met up with the rest of the Reaveys who were in the hospital, where she was told that Brian was dead. As the evening wore on, most of the Reavey family ended up in the hospital, waiting to hear any updates on Anthony. Jimmy was meant to identify the bodies of his sons, but as he had a weak heart, Seamus did it instead. Anthony spent the evening being operated on and having bullets removed from his groin and legs. Interestingly, none of his vital organs were damaged in the shooting, though there was a massive amount of blood lost. For Eugene, the whole evening was a blur. He remembers Father Malone leading a rosary, and his father praying for the gunmen and pleading with his sons not to seek revenge. While in the hospital, Eugene also remembers hearing that 3 Catholics, all from the same family, had also been shot. The O'Dowd family were a Catholic family who lived just 15 miles away from the Reavey family, in the area of Ballydugan. Barney O'Dowd ran a farm and successful coal and milk delivery business in the area. On the same night as the shooting in the Reavey family home, the O'Dowds were having a family reunion and there were 16 people in the house. It was 6:20 p.m. The men were sitting in the living room playing piano with some of the children. There was a knock on the door. Assuming it was another guest arriving, Kathleen O'Dowd opened the door. 3 masked gunmen pushed their way in, telling her that they were looking for money. She tried to force the door closed, but they pushed past her and made their way into the living room. They then sprayed the room with bullets, killing 61-year-old Joseph O'Dowd and his nephews, 24-year-old Barry and 19-year-old Declan O'Dowd. So on one night, 2 families were attacked in their homes, leaving 5 Catholic civilians dead and 1 seriously injured. Late in the evening, Sadie and Jimmy travelled back in convoy back to Eugene's house to stay the night. He was surprised that after a night of such violence, there was virtually no RUC or British Army presence. It was eerily quiet. He went to sleep thinking it couldn't get any worse than this, but it certainly could the next day. The following day, the news was out, and it was being widely reported around Northern Ireland and overseas. Most reports suggested that the attack was carried out by the loyalist paramilitary group, the UVF. Seamus Reavey returned to the family home but couldn't get in through the front door. He climbed in through a window at the back of the house and realised that the house had been completely ransacked. The British Army must have returned in the middle of the night and torn the place apart, presumably looking for weapons or ammunition. It would appear that they were determined to find proof that some of the Reaveys were involved in paramilitary activity. In his book, Eugene felt that everything surrounding this investigation was quite suspicious, and I'll outline his reasons throughout this episode. Seamus went away and brought Jimmy back to the house, and as they arrived back, a man from the Newry Housing Executive arrived. He had been given instructions to replace all the doors and repair the house, which had been ransacked and covered in bullet holes. Surely the police would need the crime scene to be preserved, Eugene thought. As well as that, it was near impossible to get the housing executive to come out in a timely fashion, as they were often inundated with a backlog of jobs. Them being here, first thing in the morning the day after the shooting, was a bit unusual. Eugene felt that this was an attempt by someone in power to hide evidence and sanitise the crime scene before the media descended upon the house. A forensic team did arrive at 11 a.m. and surveyed the crime scene before leaving. Despite this, 14 bullet casings were found by family members and friends shortly after they left. It was a busy day for the surviving members of the Reavey family. Blood from the floors needed to be cleaned, and the house needed to be prepared for the wake. For those listening outside of Ireland, it is customary in Catholicism for the body to repose one night in the family home before being buried. Family and friends could then come and pay their respects and say goodbye one last time. All the family and neighbours, both Protestant and Catholic alike, then brought food, sandwiches, bread, eggs, cake and biscuits to the house. Meanwhile, Seamus and Jimmy were in Uri picking out coffins for John Martin and Brian. A grave digger then had to be sourced, and all the men had to find black ties and white shirts, which wasn't easy with such short notice. There was a military presence at both ends of the road which the Reavey house was on. There were also military helicopters circling throughout the day, but by 4 p.m. they had retreated back to their barracks. Jimmy then gave a statement to the media, who had spent the day gathered outside his home. He said, quote, "I have lived in this house all my life, and I've had good relations with my Protestant neighbours. I have worked all my life more for Protestant farmers than my Catholic neighbours. There is no reason at all for this attack on my family. My feeling is that if their deaths help to stop the killings, then they may not have died in vain. I appeal that there will be no retaliation for the murder of my sons. As we knelt down to say our prayer last night and prayed for my sons who died and the son who was injured, we prayed also for the men who shot them, because they will have more to suffer as the years go on." It was a poignant statement from a man who'd lost both of his sons. He was basically saying that there have been so many tit-for-tat killings that hopefully the killings of his sons would see the end to them. But that wouldn't be the case. At 5:45 that evening, a convoy of around 30 cars left the Reavey family home heading to the hospital to collect the bodies of Brian and John Martin. Eugene was in the lead car, and they went through the Kings Mills crossroads and past a corner. Off in the distance, he saw a stalled vehicle. Then a man appeared in front of them waving his hands. Eugene knew him, and the man told him not to continue on, as there had been a shocking massacre up ahead. Eugene got out of his car and ran towards the stalled vehicle. It was a red Ford minibus. Initially, he thought the bus had struck some cattle that had gotten onto the road, but as he got closer, he saw bodies strewn all over the road. Eugene Reavey had just stumbled upon what has gone on to become known as the Kingsmill Massacre, which saw Republican gunmen flag down a bus bringing textile workers home from work. Initially, the workers thought it was a British Army checkpoint. They were ordered off the bus and told to stand against it with their hands up on the roof. One of the masked men then asked them which one was the Catholic. Most of the workers on the bus were Protestant, but one man, Richard Hughes, was a Catholic. Assuming this was loyalists intent on killing Hughes, his Protestant workmates tried to stop him from identifying himself. Eventually Hughes identified himself and stood forward. He was told by the masked men, "Get down the road and don't look back." The gunmen weren't here for him. They were here for everybody else. The lead gunmen said one word, "Right," and then a volley of bullets were fired into the men standing by the bus. After the initial burst of gunfire, the gunmen reloaded and went to each man on the ground and shot them in the head. 10 men died at the scene, with one man, Alan Black, surviving, despite being shot 18 times. I've done an episode on it in the past, and Alan Black's recollection of the shootings is one of the most harrowing things I think I've ever heard in my life. Eugene had arrived on the scene before the army or police had, and was overwhelmed by his own grief, and the sense that the world around him was falling apart. He said to the man he knew, who was also at the scene, "I can't handle this. We're on our way into Daisy Hill Hospital to pick up my 2 brothers who were murdered last night, and I just can't cope." The convoy had to turn around and make their way to the hospital via a different route. At the hospital, there were around 100 people who had turned up to pay their respects to the Reavey family. The lids were then placed on the coffins, and then they were placed into 2 hearses to bring the bodies back to the Reavey family home. But the hearse couldn't get out of the hospital. The bodies of the 10 dead workers had begun arriving at the hospital, and it was chaos outside, with ambulances and military vehicles. The families of those killed had also begun to arrive and were in a waiting area. Eugene went in and identified himself and offered his condolences on behalf of the Reavey family. Quote, "Our family knew them all. I offered my condolences. That massacre wasn't in our name. The victims weren't our enemies. They were our friends. They were ordinary, decent people, just like us." The cortege finally got out of the hospital, and there were around 100 cars now heading back to the family home. As they got close, they came across a British military checkpoint, and things got a bit tense. The two hearses were waved through, but Seamus, Eugene, and their mother Sadie were ordered out of their cars by the soldiers. Though they knew who the family were and what had happened to them, the soldiers made Eugene and Seamus stand with their hands up against the army Land Rover. They then began aggressively questioning Sadie. Eugene remembers what they said, but to this day he still doesn't understand what they were saying. They said, "Mrs. Reavey, isn't it great that you've no worries, and here we are standing out in the rain trying to protect you while you're having such a good time?" One of the soldiers then started rubbing his fingers around her face, saying, "Mrs. Reavey, I see you only have 2 ears. Where's your other ear? Mrs. Reavey, I see you only have 1 nose. Where's your other nose?" Eugene and Seamus were fuming by this point, and maybe that was the point of the provocation, to force a response from them. Perhaps to get revenge for what had happened to the 10 Protestants earlier that evening. Eugene stood in the rain with his outstretched hands against the jeep, with a gun poking into his back, doing his best not to give the soldiers an excuse to react. They then asked Seamus to open the boot of his car. Inside were the blood-soaked clothes that Brian, Anthony and John Martin had been wearing when they were killed. The soldier emptied the blood-soaked clothes on the ground and began to dance on them, while his colleagues laughed. The entire ordeal lasted around 20 minutes before the soldiers drove off. The group finally arrived home by around 9 p.m. that evening. Hundreds of people showed up to pay their respects, but Seamus, Eugene and Sadie were left quite shaken by the interaction with the soldiers. It further convinced Eugene that there was something amiss here. The wake went on well into the night, with some staying up all night with the bodies. In one 24-hour period, there had been the killing at the Reavey household and O'Dowd household, and then there was the killing of the Protestant workers. This was all in a relatively small radius. People in the area were terrified. Eugene's aunties had flown into Dublin from the US and had to be convinced to then drive up to the funeral, as they were so scared of more attacks. The day after the wake, there was a knock on the door at 7 a.m. It was soldiers looking to interview Eugene in relation to the killing at Kingsmills the previous night, as he was one of the first people to arrive on the scene. The door was slammed in their face that morning. This was the morning of his brother's funerals. Meanwhile, Anthony was still ill in the hospital, and the family would do shifts at his bedside. Because he was a living witness, there was a fear that the loyalists might try and come back and kill him. Alan Black, who was the sole survivor at Kingsmills, became friends with Anthony, as they were both in a serious condition in the hospital. The families of both men would make sure to visit each of them when they came into the hospital, and it was looking like both men would make a full recovery.
His parents and brothers were in to see Anthony. They never left the hospital without coming to see me. My father and brothers always went in to see Anthony. But then Anthony was in a wheelchair at that time, and he used to, like in between visiting, he used to wheel his chair in to my ward. We sort of got to know one another pretty well. And he was a nice young lad. A very nice lad.
The two of you really recovered together?
We were recovering together and we had something in common. We never spoke about it. We never spoke about his brothers. We never spoke about the boys. It was too close to the two of us. It was too soon. But we sort of took comfort in each other that we were two of a kind, if you like.
The killing of the Reavey brothers was claimed by a group calling itself the Protestant Action Force, which was a cover name by members of the UVF. But we will learn soon enough that there is another group tied to this attack, the Glenanne Gang. That week, 2,000 people gathered in Uri to peacefully call for the paramilitaries to get off the backs of the working class and allow them to go about their work in peace. Jimmy made another statement to the media, expressing his disappointment at how his pleas not to have any retaliatory killings were ignored. The funeral for John Martin and Brian took place on Wednesday, January 7th. The village of Whitecross had draped itself in black flags as a mark of respect to the men. Eugene felt that the British Army did their best to make all the mourners uncomfortable throughout the day, with helicopters flying loudly overhead. soldiers pointing their weapons at the mourners and also taking pictures of some of them. The violence was really taking its toll on this small community. Many homes were left vacant at night, with families working on the farms during the days and then spending the night with relatives elsewhere, as loyalists continued to threaten Catholic families and the IRA continued to threaten Protestant ones. Over the years, a number of Protestant homeowners along the Armagh-Monaghan border opted to sell their farms and move away. Politically, these killings were causing significant shockwaves too. The British Secretary of Defence, Roy Mason, proposed that County Armagh be given a new category as a special emergency area, with the reintroduction of internment. Other ideas were proposed, including curfews, ID cards, and even the laying of a minefield along the border. These didn't end up occurring. What did happen, though, was a deployment of an 85-person-strong SAS unit in the area. These were units who had been working in Dhofar in southern Oman, training local tribesmen in what became known as irregular operations. Their skills in the mountainous desert of Oman seemingly made them a suitable choice for deployment in South Armagh. This deployment was publicly announced by Prime Minister Harold Wilson, which was an unusual move as they usually operated in secrecy. And this deployment first occurred on January 9th. The Irish government weren't exactly happy with this setup, with Justice Minister Paddy Cooney raising his concerns and asking his British counterparts to stress that, quote, these trained killers would also be used against loyalists and not exclusively targeting the IRA. It would seem, at least according to Anne Cadwallader in the book Lethal Allies, that the focus remained solely on the provisional IRA and not the loyalists, who were also carrying out these lethal attacks on the civilian population. Of the 39 civilians killed in Armagh in 1975, 20 were killed by the UVF, yet the idea of combating loyalists never seemed to come up in political discourse. The Ulster Defence Regiment was an infantry regiment of the British Army, established in 1970, mainly composed of Northern Irish Protestants. During this period, it was known that a number of loyalist paramilitaries had infiltrated the UDR. A report released 3 years earlier estimated that between 5 to 15% of the UDR was composed of people in loyalist paramilitary groups. Then there was the Northern Irish Police Force, the RUC. Were there loyalist paramilitaries working in the RUC? It was clear that the soldiers were convinced that Eugene and his family were a paramilitary family. Eugene became aware of this after a family friend told him that there had been a whisper campaign going on, saying that the brothers were targeted because they were IRA. Just to be clear, the Reavey family were in no way involved in paramilitary groups. It would emerge later that year that his brother-in-law, Paddy Quinn, was in the IRA, but no Reavey has ever been a member. Quinn would go on to spend 47 days on hunger strike before his mother took him off. After the funeral, life returned to some form of normality for Eugene, and the focus became getting Anthony out of the hospital. But the harassment from the British soldiers continued. On Thursday, January 8th, Seamus and his parents were driving to visit Anthony at the hospital when they came across an army checkpoint. They were asked where they were going and were waved on, but then they came across another checkpoint a few minutes later. When the soldier heard their name, he said, "Ah, it's the Reaveys. Pull your fucking car in there, Mr. Reavey." The family were questioned for 15 minutes, and the soldier did the same thing the other soldier had done with Mrs. Reavey a few days earlier, asking her nonsensical questions. She was mocked and humiliated again by a different soldier. After 2 weeks, Anthony was finally released from the hospital. He'd been making a steady recovery and things were looking up. This was something the entire family needed, some good news amidst the bloodshed. But the harassment continued. In one instance, Anthony had to travel 2 miles from his home to his girlfriend's house. Oliver offered to drive him and was stopped at 5 army checkpoints in that 2-mile distance, all asking the same questions and searching the car. The soldiers would have no doubt been in communication with each other, but they were deliberately targeting the Reaveys. After dropping off Anthony, Oliver was then stopped 5 more times on the journey home. That evening, Sadie ended up phoning Anthony and telling him to stay the night at his girlfriend's house. He ended up staying at an aunt's house instead, which was near his girlfriend's house. The next day, his aunt and her husband got up to go to Mass. Anthony decided to stay home. When they returned home, they found Anthony fully dressed but collapsed and unconscious at the top of the stairs. They immediately phoned an ambulance, and Anthony was taken to Daisy Hill Hospital. He was admitted to the hospital, but doctors were unsure what his condition was, as he was still unconscious. The next day, a specialist arrived and made the recommendation that he be moved to the neurological department at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast. His condition was far more serious than initially thought. He was transferred there and remained on life support. There was a build-up of fluid in his brain, so that was drained, but there was still no change. Eventually, one of the leading neurosurgeons in the world at the time, Dr. Derek Gordon, took charge of his care. Eugene sat down with him to talk about Anthony's condition. Dr. Gordon was direct and said that the prognosis was not good, and if there was no improvement in the next few days, then it would be time to consider switching off the life support machine. If the machine was left on, he would spend the rest of his life brain dead and in a vegetative state. Eugene sat with this information and found himself unable to tell his parents or the rest of the family, and hoped that the prognosis would change overnight. It didn't, and the next day Dr. Gordon explained the situation to the family, that Anthony was brain dead. The family comforted each other and collectively decided that switching off life support was the best thing for everyone. The machine was switched off, and by 6:30 that evening, Anthony had passed away. At just 17 years old, he was the youngest member of the Reavey family to lose his life, dying a month after his two brothers. People were quite surprised to hear that Anthony had died, as they had seen him out and about on crutches just days earlier. Officially, he died as a result of a brain hemorrhage. The pathologist noted his death was from natural causes, unrelated to the shooting. This upset the family, who believed that the attack must have played some role in his death. It would be decades later that Eugene would eventually learn that a few days after Anthony's death, the coroner changed this from natural causes to an open verdict. At Anthony's funeral, Jimmy collapsed. He had a weak heart, and burying a third son in less than a month, the shootings and the constant army presence just became too much for him. He was given an injection and was ultimately okay, but the family doctor made sure to visit the house several times a day over the next few weeks, just to be sure. After the shootings, Sadie and Jimmy had no desire to stay in the family home, so they moved into their son Seamus's home. Seamus, his wife Teresa, and their children then moved in with Eugene and his wife and their children. But the harassment from the British soldiers didn't stop. Within a few days of Anthony dying, there was a knock at the door of Seamus's home. It was a British soldier, claiming he was carrying out a census on all the houses in White Cross. He wanted to know who was in the house, and he asked why Jimmy and Sadie weren't in their actual home. He then asked where Brian, John Martin and Anthony were, to which he was told they were murdered. He then asked who did it, why were they murdered, and if the brothers were in the IRA. This went on for over an hour, and it would appear that the soldier was trying to trip Jimmy up in his questioning. The next day it was Eugene's turn. It was a Monday, and Eugene was returning to work to get his mind off the past few weeks. He left his home and made it 150 yards before driving into a British Army checkpoint. He was told to get out of the car and then asked if he knew who was involved in the shooting of the people at Kingsmills. I wouldn't. How would I know that? Two other soldiers approached him and marched him up to a river beside the road. Eugene was then told to jump in. He refused and then he was pushed in. He knelt there in the fast-flowing water which was up to his chin. He thought he was about to die and prayed to his three brothers. A soldier walked into the river and put a pistol up to his temple and asked again, "Who shot the people at Kingsmills?" Eugene repeated, "I don't know." The soldier pulled the trigger. There was a clicking noise. The chamber was empty. He continued to do this 6 more times, while shouting the same question at Eugene over and over and over. Eugene was certain that there was a bullet in the gun, and that sooner or later one of the clicks would be an actual shot. One of the soldiers behind him shouted, "Blow his fucking brains out, Sarge." Eventually, there was quiet. Eugene didn't move for 15 minutes, then turned around and the soldiers were gone. He dragged himself out of the river and drove home. Eugene was stopped and dragged into the river with a gun pointed at his head, again on Tuesday, then on Thursday, and on Friday. Eventually, the local priest, Father Hughes, called into the army barracks to complain about the conduct of the soldiers. The officer in charge denied that anything had occurred, saying there was no record of the incidents in the soldiers' logs. Father Hughes then confided in Eugene, saying that he was considering requesting a transfer out of the area, as he was afraid he would be killed by a British Army squad. Such was their animosity against Catholics in this area. Another incident saw Eugene removed from his brand new car, and then the army ripped out the seats, took the wheels off the car, and threw the keys into a field. He tried to lodge a complaint in the barracks for this incident, to which he was told, "If you weren't shooting at your neighbours, this wouldn't be happening to you." The army was convinced that Eugene was a paramilitary. It's really hard to convey the attitude of the British military towards the civilian population in this area during this time period. Eugene was not the only person who was subjected to this type of treatment on a daily basis. Another case that Eugene talks about in his book is the killing of 12-year-old Magella O'Hare. It was August 14th, 1976. A sad day for the Reaveys, as this was the date that Brian was due to marry his fiancée Alice. Jimmy, Seamus, Alice and Colleen decided to visit the graves of Brian, John Martin and Anthony. They headed off to Ballymoyer graveyard, but when they got out of the car they noticed 6 soldiers coming into the graveyard. They passed by the soldiers and one of them recognised Seamus, saying, "Seamus Reavey, I want a word with you when you're finished." The family continued on and cleaned up the graves before laying the flowers and saying a prayer. They took their time, hoping the soldiers would lose interest and move on. They didn't, and when the family got back to the car, one shouted over to Seamus, saying, "Seamus Reavey, come up here or I'll knock your fucking block off." The soldier began verbally berating Seamus, telling him that the IRA murdered his brothers because they refused to kill UDR men. While this was going on, nearby on a road, a group of 8 schoolgirls were on their way to confession at the local church, laughing and giggling as they were walking. Then a shot rang out in the air. And then there was screaming coming from the schoolgirls. They were huddled around each other, and in the middle on the ground was 12-year-old Magella. She had been shot in the left side of her stomach and was bleeding heavily. Her father, Jim, was 150 yards away digging up weeds outside the church when he heard the shot. He ran toward the scene and saw his daughter lying on the ground. He scooped her up in his arms, but as he did so, a soldier approached him shouting, "What the fucking hell are you doing here?" "I'm the girl's father," Jim responded. The soldier issued a command to take his hands off her. Jim replied, quote, "This is the only wee girl I have left." The soldier continued to demand that he put her back down on the ground, where she writhed in pain. Eventually another soldier picked her up. Seamus and Alice were nearby, having watched the entire situation unfold. Alice was a nurse, and Seamus asked the nearby soldier if she could go down and administer aid. They were told no. The soldier then had a change of heart and led her over to Magella. The bullet had passed through her abdomen. While Alice was administering aid, one of the soldiers shouted, "This is your fucking provost for you." They were trying to insinuate that the Provisional IRA were in some way responsible for this shooting. In reality, the bullet had been fired by British paratrooper Private Michael Williams, who fired 2 shots in her direction. He claimed that he spotted an IRA gunman in a nearby hedge, and that he shouted out a warning before firing. An army helicopter arrived and put Magella inside with her father and Alice. Eugene goes on to describe quite a graphic scene, with Alice using her hands to try and keep Magella's intestines inside her body as the girl struggled to breathe. As she was doing this, she was again berated by some of the soldiers. "Go on, you fucking provo nurse. You're stuck in this again." This was meant to be Alice's wedding day, but instead she was visiting the grave of her fiancé and now trying to save a young girl's life while being insulted by soldiers. For Magella, it was too late, and she passed away in the helicopter and was pronounced dead at the hospital. The whole incident was a huge embarrassment for the army. The shooter, Michael Williams, claimed that an IRA sniper had shot at him, and Magella was caught in the crossfire. But there was never any evidence to back this up. He was charged with murder, which was then reduced to manslaughter, and then he was eventually acquitted by Judge Morris Gibson. Gibson and his wife would later be killed by an IRA car bomb, and it's believed that one of the reasons for his targeting was his acquittal of Michael Williams. The UK government apologised for this killing in 2011 and said that the justification Gibson accepted was unlikely. It was acts such as this, as well as the treatment of the Reaveys, that would cause a huge amount of upset in this small area, and a deep, deep mistrust of the British Army. As 1976 drew to a close, for the Reavey family there was little justice. No one had been arrested for the killing of the brothers, and Eugene believed that the bare minimum of an investigation had been carried out. In the investigation into the killings at the O'Dowd family home, Barney O'Dowd, who was injured in the shooting but not killed, believed that he recognised one of the gunmen as a local loyalist. So 16 days after the shooting, the suspected gunman was arrested. He had a weak alibi, and officers found firearm residue on some of his clothing, which he couldn't explain. An anonymous caller also phoned the police and named this man as the shooter on the night. Despite this compelling evidence, the man was released, and it does not appear that the police followed up on this investigation. And to this day, no one has ever been convicted in the killings at the O'Dowd home. In 1977, there was an inquest into the deaths of Brian, John Martin and Anthony. Eugene recalls a hostile atmosphere in the courthouse, as army and police believed that the Reaveys were an IRA family. This inquest was seen as a whitewash. The state pathologist concluded that after an autopsy of the bodies, the injuries were caused by bullets of a low to medium velocity, saying that there was no indication that they were fired from close range. This was simply untrue, as all the men were shot in their homes from attackers in the same room as them. The pathologist also found that there was no connection between Anthony's shooting and his death, and that he died 1 month after being shot of natural causes. In 1981, tragedy struck again when Jimmy Reavey died. He was only 57, which was quite a young age. Since 1976, he had 14 heart-related attacks, and Eugene believes that the loss of his sons, combined with the stress of daily living in Northern Ireland, contributed to his death in some way. Shortly before Jimmy died, he spoke to Eugene, asking him if he knew who killed his sons. Eugene said he didn't, and Jimmy explained that he knew their names. He told him shortly after the killing, a local publican came into the house saying that he overheard a conversation in a pub. A large number of people were involved, and 5 UVF members carried out the killings. He then told Eugene their names, but was very clear. He didn't want Eugene to pass their names on to the IRA. He didn't want any more retaliatory killings. Eugene was conflicted. He wanted to go to the RUC and report the names, but he didn't trust them. He believed that the RUC would go and tell the suspects instead of arresting them. He decided to do nothing with this information and try and move on with his life. Eugene went on to set up a construction company and ended up working in some loyalist areas in Belfast. When building houses there, he ended up having to pay protection money to the loyalist paramilitary group, the UDA, which was quite common at the time. Pay the money or your machinery gets stolen and your site gets vandalised. The person he liaised directly with was Jimmy Craig, who was a well-known figure in loyalism, but more known for his extortion. On more than one occasion, UDA members would show him information given to them by the RUC. In one case was a copy of a statement Eugene made to the RUC on an occasion where he had been arrested. The RUC were trying to get to Craig, so they wanted Eugene to admit that he was paying him protection money, but he refused, knowing that saying Craig's name to police was a death sentence. Another time, a series of photos of suspected Republican paramilitaries were taken by the RUC Special Branch and then given to the UDA, who then showed them to Eugene. Why were the RUC giving loyalist paramilitaries this information? Things took a turn for the worse for Eugene in 1988, where he was arrested again after being caught with 715 fraudulent tax certificates. It doesn't appear that Eugene was taking advantage of the system in Northern Ireland, but rather this was set up as a means of paying protection money to the UDA. It was the only way he could continue building houses while paying the hefty protection fee, and it was suggested by the UDA to him. But all of this was irrelevant in the eyes of the law. This time, Eugene was sent to prison, but was released after a few months. But he was then faced with a hefty tax bill, which forced him to move into the Republic of Ireland for a few years. In 1999, Eugene's life was once again turned upside down, as a result of the words of Ian Paisley. Ian Paisley was the leader of the political party, the DUP, and throughout the years, his contribution to the escalation and eventual de-escalation of the Troubles was significant. On the 27th of January, Paisley made an address to the House of Commons in London. In this address, he said that he was seeking justice for the Protestants killed in the Kingsmills massacre. In his statement, he said, quote, "Eugene Reavey, a well-known Republican, set up the Kingsmill massacre." There was absolutely no proof of this, but it put a crosshair on Eugene's back. The SDLP's Seamus Mallon said that Ian Paisley had committed an act of the grossest irresponsibility. Pressure mounted on Paisley to retract his statement, but he held firm. Eventually, Eugene had to go to the Chief Constable of Northern Ireland, Ronnie Flanagan, and ask him to issue a public statement saying that he was not a suspect in the hunt for justice for those killed in Kingsmills. So with Eugene being accused of carrying out Kingsmills, who was being accused of carrying out the killing of his brothers? John Weir is a name that has come up on this podcast many times. He was an Ulster loyalist, born in the Republic of Ireland in 1950. He served as an officer in the RUC's Special Patrol Group. These were essentially the RUC's anti-terror unit. The RUC was overwhelmingly Protestant, and the Special Patrol Group, or SPG, unit was 100% Protestant, and Weir claimed that they were very anti-Republican and rife with sectarian attitudes. He claimed that he and his colleagues regularly bet up Catholic civilians with Republican sympathies. By the end of 1973, the SPG were unhappy with the political stance in Westminster regarding Northern Ireland. The British government had adopted a softly approach, which meant that they were acting cautiously and patiently, avoiding direct action or force. Some members of the SPG felt that they would have to, quote, break the rules to curb the terrorists. So that meant that in the 70s, Weir had a double life. On one hand, his career in the RUC was growing, and would eventually see him promoted to the rank of sergeant, but on the other, he was also a rising paramilitary in the UVF. First meeting with Robin Jackson in 1974. As a member of the UVF, Weir was loosely linked to a number of attacks, but it wasn't until 1976 where it's believed that he joined the Glenanne gang. I've done a 2-part episode on it before, but now would be a good time to talk about the Glenanne gang. They were a secret group of Ulster loyalists who were composed of paramilitaries, but what makes them different is that they were also composed of serving soldiers and police officers. The name of the gang was given to them in later years, and it should be noted that loyalists that I've talked to on this podcast have dismissed their entire existence, but there is an abundance of evidence to support that there was some level of communication between these groups, especially on the farm of RUC reservist James Mitchell, who lived very close to the Reavey family home. In fact, when Eugene worked in poultry, he would visit James's farm semi-regularly. John Weir joined the gang after the Kingsmills massacre. He believed the culprits to be the Provisional IRA and thought that they would continue to target Protestant civilians, so he believed that he would be useful to the UVF, since he was still a member of the police force, the RUC. In 1999, Weir gave a sworn affidavit to a journalist with the Sunday Times newspaper. In the affidavit, Weir named all the men who took part in the Reavey brothers' killing. He then stated that Robin Jackson, aka the Jackal, was the one who carried out the killing in the O'Dowd family home. One of the men Weir named was Robert McConnell, who was in the UDR. While in hospital, Anthony Reavey gave a description of one of the gunmen, which matched Robert. Another was an RUC officer. As of writing, here are the names of the people believed to have been involved in the killing of the Reavey brothers. Loyalist paramilitary Willie Fraser is believed to have driven the getaway car. He died in 2019. Loyalist Robin Jackson took part in the planning, and then it's believed that he was the gunman at the O'Dowd shooting. He died in 1998. RUC officer William McCaughey told Eugene that he was in the house when his brothers were killed, but that he fired no shots. McCaughey died in 2006. And then we have RUC reservist James Mitchell and his housekeeper Lily Shields. It's believed that James Mitchell's farm was the epicentre of the Glenanne gang. It was where the RUC and army could step in, and it was also where loyalists could gather. John Weir claimed that the attack on the Reaveys was planned here. McCaughey claimed that Mitchell and Shields were driving the getaway car after the Reavey shooting, which contradicts the claim that Willie Fraser was driving. James Mitchell died in 2008 and Shields sometime after. There are more names, but they are of people still alive, so I am hesitant to say them here. So why were the Reaveys targeted? There are a couple of potential reasons. 1975 was a year for wanton tit-for-tat violence, and many reprisal attacks for the killing of Catholics and Protestants. All amidst this uneasy ceasefire, which was for the most part holding. But for the Glenanne gang, this ceasefire holding was the last thing that they would have wanted. They wanted the IRA to break their ceasefire and continue carrying out attacks. The logic behind this was to escalate violence to the point where the IRA would feel compelled to abandon the ceasefire and resume hostilities, therefore providing political justification for harsher security measures and further military intervention in Northern Ireland. So how would they do this? By carrying out attacks on the civilian population. Anne Cadwallader is the author of the fantastic book Lethal Allies, which is also a source for this episode. She has a different take.
So we asked ourselves why these people? And we drew up two lists. One was of people who were unlucky enough to be caught up in indiscriminate pub and car bombs. And the other list was of people who were targeted, who were watched, chased, hunted at their work or at their home. And we discovered to our surprise that every single one of those, bar one, were self-starters, people who were making something of their lives. They were ordinary people. And then we asked ourselves why? Why these people? And the theory we came to was that Frank Kitson, in his classic manual of counterinsurgency operations, wrote that if you can't catch the fish, either by rod or by net, then poison the water. And our theory is that these ordinary people were targeted to persuade other ordinary people to repudiate the IRA, to withdraw support from the IRA. Of course, it didn't work. It had the opposite effect. Violence begets violence. If people can't trust the law, they will take the law into their own hands. It was completely counterproductive, as well as illegal and immoral.
Lethal Allies presents compelling evidence that collusion between loyalists and security forces was systematic and extensive, particularly in the 1970s. It wasn't just a few bad apples. In the year 2006, Dave Cox got in touch with Eugene. He was the head of the Historical Inquiries Team, or HET. The HET was a unit of the Police Service of Northern Ireland set up in September 2005 to investigate the thousands of unsolved murders which took place during the Troubles. Dave met with Eugene and his mother Sadie, and for the first time, 30 years after the killing of their brothers, they received an apology from a British state official. Dave said, quote, "Mrs. Reavey, I want to apologise to you for the murder of your sons and the failure of any government or security force personnel to call around and inquire about your well-being. I also want to confirm to you that your sons were completely innocent victims and had no connection to any paramilitary group. Furthermore, I want to apologise to you for the appalling treatment and harassment handed out to you and your family by members of the security services." Eugene remembers this apology and said for his mother, it was as if a physical burden had been lifted off her shoulders. Leaving Sadie's home, Dave promised that he would leave no stone unturned to give her a fully detailed report into the killings. In 2010, a 70-page report into the killings was released, which lists numerous holes and gaps and raises some significant questions regarding police and army activity relating to the shooting at the Reavey home. There are many, but here is just a few. For one, it detailed discrepancies in RUC statements which were made after the attack. It also linked guns used in the Reavey shooting to other attacks in the area. which included linking the purchasing of weapons by an RUC officer who then sold them to the UVF in Portadown. The report also found that none of the 3 closest police stations to the Reavey home had any incident log books from this period. Daily logs such as this would have been incredibly common and accessible years later in most police stations in Northern Ireland. So to have nothing from this period is most unusual. The getaway car used in the killings was reported stolen days before the attack, but this wasn't logged on the day it was reported. The car was subsequently burnt out, but this scene wasn't preserved, and the car was taken away. There was also the issue of the security checkpoint beside the Reavey home on the night of the killings, which mysteriously disappeared shortly after the men were shot. There was a hope that after the release of this report, the suspects who were still alive could be arrested and interrogated. But the hands were tied of the HET team. That could only occur if new evidence came to light. But many ex-RUC officers remained tight-lipped and refused to cooperate with the HET. Despite this, the report was significant. It stated that the Reaveys had absolutely no links to paramilitary activity and had no links to the King's Mills attack. Ian Paisley never recanted his claim about Eugene. It also brought to light the intimidation that the family faced by the army for years after the attack and their appalling treatment. It also raised many examples of suspicious activity which amount to collusion between the paramilitaries, the RUC and British Army. But its power to actually see people imprisoned was limited. The HET closed down in 2014, citing budget cuts. Eugene continued in his quest for justice, though. He was trying other avenues. But what did he want? For the most part, he wanted one thing, and that's an acknowledgement that the British state and its various security agencies had colluded with loyalist terrorists to kill the Reavey brothers. A case was brought to the European Court of Human Rights, focusing on Article 2 of the European Convention of Human Rights, stating that every person's right to life should be protected by law. The courts ruled in favour of the Reaveys, citing a lack of independence by the RUC in investigating the case. Since then, it's been an uphill battle by Eugene and scores of other family members trying to find answers. Much of the curtain has been lifted since the killings on that fateful day, but what was found behind raised even more questions, and the people with the capacity to answer them are slowly dying of old age. Eugene also discovered, thanks to the work of Kieran McCart and his Operation Paper Trail, that an 84-year embargo has been placed on files relating to the killing of the Reavey brothers. His family were never notified of this, and the files won't be released until 2061. 2026 will mean that it has been 50 years since the killing of the Reavey brothers. So where do things lie now? In 2022, Eugene learned some new information after a Catholic neighbour came forward and said that decades ago he made a delivery to James Mitchell's farm, where there were some notes on the table with a list of names. The Reavey boys were named in that list. He then got an anonymous phone call later that evening telling him to forget anything he saw on the table. Why was James Mitchell keeping tabs on the Reaveys some years before the attack was carried out? As of 2024, the Public Prosecution Service of Northern Ireland said that the evidence available was insufficient to provide a reasonable prospect of conviction against 2 former police officers who have been named for being involved in the killing. Then in 2025, Eugene Reavey and Ken Murray released the book, The Killing of the Reavey Brothers, British Murder and Cover-Up in Northern Ireland, which again is the primary source for this episode, and hopefully this will bring renewed attention to the case. This more or less brings us to the end of the story of the killing of the Reavey brothers. This episode ended up being a lot more than just about the killing itself. The soldiers in Armagh had branded the Reaveys as terrorists, which allowed them to completely dehumanise them as people. And the Reaveys had nowhere to go. They couldn't look to the RUC or army for help when they needed it most, because they didn't trust them. Where they did look was to their neighbours, to their community and to their faith. Eugene mentions time and time again in his book that when they were at their lowest, it was their Protestant and Catholic neighbours who were there to provide help and support. I think we'll leave it there for now. Thanks, and see you next time.